And again, please welcome Jim Davis.
That's okay. I can ignore it.
But they can see your, they can see your notes.
Oh, they can?
Yeah, we'll stop sharing.
Okay. They can see him?
No, not that share screen.
Okay. Sorry, a little technical difficulties here.
No problem.
We'll get it. Okay. Now we're on track. Thanks to Aiden. Well, anyway, I first just like to say thank you for giving me an opportunity to present the results of our study. And this is an old photo. I actually have it on the wall right here that I found at an antique store in Fulton, Missouri, about 50 years ago. And Missouri is where I grew up. And I had no idea where this beautiful mountain was, and but I vowed that someday I was going to go there. So all of a sudden, up to real time, it is Mount Shuksan, and it actually is the namesake for the organization that I'm affiliated with now. We started our Heather Meadows project about 10 years ago, and I have to admit it was really more of a subalpine therapy initially, just getting up into the meadows and observing the bees and the flowers. But then I started taking out some folks from the Native Plant Society, the Como-Colchian chapter in Whatcom County. And we just kept talking about it, kept observing, and finally the whole thing just transitioned into a major research project with protocol and everything else. And I had 15 volunteers, including myself, from the Native Plant Society, and that managed to pull off this 5-year study. And as I go along and talk about the methodology, you can see what a miracle it was that people stuck with it for that long. And it's fortuitous for those who want more information from this. Just today, the preprint from a publication in Northwest Science has been posted to their website. So if you're interested in the details, which I can't necessarily delve into for every issue, please go to their website. You can see the published article. It's not published yet, but the preprint. So what did we do there? Being part of the Native Plant Society and being trained as an entomologist, I obviously focused on native plants and their native bumblebee pollinators, primarily bumblebees, which may be a disappointment to some of you, but that seems to be the predominant pollinator in Heather Meadows. This is a GIS map of Heather Meadows. Some of you are probably familiar with the area and others not. This is Mount Baker, it's a ski area. Mount Shuksan, and then Ross Lake is on over here, and Bellingham's way over here on the left. And then the yellow box in the middle is Heather Meadows, and that's where we actually did our research. And one thing I wanted you all to notice that the blue area is above 4,200 feet. And on north-facing slopes, that's the meadows start at about 4,200 feet. South-facing slopes, some of the tree line goes up to 5,200 feet, but north-facing, and you can see the contiguous meadows all the way from Mount Baker, almost all the way over to Ross Lake. This is Sourdough, and these are Bacon Peak here, I think, and so it's a large area up there, almost with contiguous meadow. And I debated whether to even leave these next few slides in since I'm presenting to the Native Bee Society, but thought, well, whatever, maybe it'll be of interest to some people. Bumblebees have a life cycle where the queen overwinters in a small hole in the ground, comes out in the spring, forages, lays eggs, provisions the nest, raises that first brood of workers. Then the queen pretty much stays in the nest after that, and the workers do the foraging. Eventually, the queen shifts over to birthing next year's queens and males, and then everybody dies except next year's queen, and then that queen goes and hibernates over winter in a hole in the ground. And this chart shows about 30 weeks for that cycle, and we found that in Heather Meadows, a much more severe climate than most, that it's more like 20 weeks. But this is the basic pattern. Also, most of you are aware of the benefits of pollination by wild bees. I don't think I even need to say this, but $3 billion in agricultural economy depends on it. 15% of U.S. agricultural crops. And bumblebees fly at cooler temperatures, which makes them not only superior pollinators for early season crops, but also for many native plants that bloom early. Healthy bumblebee populations are crucial for the continued existence of many native plants. And as you'll see through this study, bumblebees are the primary pollinator in subalpine meadows and are important, very important for huckleberries and ultimately for species that feed on huckleberries like bears. So as you all know, there's been a decline in wild bee populations, 23% between 2008 and 2013. If anybody knows any updated articles with regard to populations of native bees, I'd love to hear about it. I haven't seen any recently. The decline in wild bees is greatest in areas that grow specialty crops. That's including Washington State with our blueberries and raspberries, California, other areas around the country. And 4 bumblebee species have declined substantially, and Bombus occidentalis just about disappeared, although it's starting to come back in Washington State. So we're kind of excited about that. Specific threats to bumblebees: loss of native flowering plant habitats in wild areas, agricultural lands, roadsides, and then also cities and towns. Declining diversity of native plants that provide continuity in pollen and nectar sources. And we talked a little bit about that earlier on in this meeting. Exposure to insects, insecticides, especially neonicotinoids, introduction of non-native bumblebees, which I think is probably not a major problem right now, but could increase in the future. And then finally, transmission of bumblebee pathogens and parasites through large-scale movement of honeybees for agriculture. So these are all significant threats to bumblebee populations. And we decided to work in an area where many of these threats don't exist, up in the mountain meadows in Washington State. They have a high diversity of flowering plants that are available throughout the season. There's very little use of insecticides and herbicides in mountain meadows. Generally, mountain meadows are isolated from agricultural areas where you're more likely to see bees transmitting diseases to bumblebees. And many of these meadows are already protected from development under wilderness and national park management. So it's kind of a cherry picking the nice places to go and study bees. And the meadows that we're most interested in are primarily west of the Pacific Crest. They're in the Olympic Peninsula, the Olympics, all the way from Mount Adams up through Mount Rainier and all the way up to Whatcom County, where you can see that we have quite an extent of meadow system up there, with the yellow being alpine, the dark yellow being subalpine, and the white being bare or snow. So in Whatcom County in particular, most of those meadow lands are federal lands between Mount Baker and Ross Lake. They're all connected, as I mentioned earlier, into a big extensive starfish-like configuration that's centered on Ruth Mountain. The meadows provide this very large continuous meadow habitat for flowering plants, pollinators, and other species. And most of those meadows are above 4,200 feet. Schreiber's Meadows is an exception. And the meadows in the northern portion of the North Cascades include 7 mountain passes below 5,200 feet. And you'll see why that might become a problem in the future. This is just a blow up to show you the Whatcom County area and how we have the continuous meadow really from Mount Baker almost all the way to Ross Lake. It's a little bit of the results of our study. I'll explain a little bit the methodology later, but we found 70 different flowering plants at Heather Meadows. 62 of those were native plants and 8 were non-native. And of the native plants, most of them received visits from pollinators. These are the most common plants that we found: the huckleberries, the heathers, with I'd say Cascade blueberry and pink mountain heather being the most abundant plants in the Heather Meadows. Sitka mountain ash, partridge foot, Arctic lupin, and fireweed. And fireweed was seen pretty much at all elevations. So we discovered that bumblebees are the primary pollinators in North Cascades subalpine meadows. They're generalists. They can obtain pollen and nectar from a sequence of flowering plants, that bloom throughout the season in subalpine meadows. They're adapted to cooler temperatures, allowing them to forage in these meadows when most of the meadow is actually still covered with snow. And at Heather Meadows, we've seen them flying at 45 degrees in light rain. The story I like to tell is I'll be going up in May and early June to monitor flowering and bumblebees, and walking on the snow and passing people who are wearing skis and snowshoes, and I'm carrying a butterfly net. They think I'm crazy, but I'm actually going up there and observing bees and flowers. And they're also strong flyers, which you'll see later is important because foraging across the elevation gradient, I think, is real important to developing strong colonies. So we saw multiple species of bumblebees. This is from 2019, and I did most of the pollinator monitoring myself in 2019 and observed 920 insects on flowers. Part of our criteria is that the insect had to be observed on flowers. And about 2/3 of those were bumblebees. Honeybees were second, and then syrphids, I believe, were third in terms of abundance. And then if you look strictly at the bumblebees, Bombus melanopygus was by far the most common, 76% of bumblebees. Flavifrons was 12%, and other unidentified bumblebees. We didn't capture them because there were so few of them that we didn't want to impact their populations. So we just left them as unidentified. Other unidentified was a small portion. These are some of the bees we saw. A is Bombus melanopygus, B is Flavifrons, Bostonsinskii, Bifarius. Let's see, what do we have there? Fernald, I believe, and Sucklei. I think I got the order right there. And then finally, we also had Bombus mixus, but we didn't include a photo on that. This is Bombus melanopygus. By far the most common, more than 50% of the pollinators we observed. And as it turns out, in a big study that was done pulling bumblebees worldwide from many different habitats, Bombus melanopygus was the least resistant to heat of all of the 30 species studied. So the most abundant pollinator by far at Heather Meadows is the least resistant to heat, which could be a major problem with climate change in the future. And then, of course, this is Flavifrons. For me, it's very easy to recognize melanopygus and Flavifrons. And Flavifrons has this black notch at the base of the abdomen, which really stands out to me. And then the rest of the species were much more challenging to identify on the fly. Just wanted to mention a little bit of context for the study. Climate change will probably be causing tree lines to move up significantly in Whatcom County. As I mentioned earlier, on the north-facing slopes, they're about 4,200 feet. But over the next 80 to 100 years, they may actually move up to 5,200 feet, which will have significant impacts on meadows in the North Cascades. And in particular, tree encroachment will create major fragmentation of those meadows, I believe, in the future. So we can look at, this is what we mean by tree encroachment coming into the meadows. This is actually an area with avalanches. Other areas, tree encroachment is occurring where the snowpack doesn't last long enough during the winter to suppress tree growth. And this is the same map I showed you earlier. The outside line is 4,200 feet. And this is the 5,200 foot line. This is Mount Baker, Mount Shuksan, Sourdough Mountain, Mount Spicker, so to orient you. So what happens when the tree line moves up 1,000 feet is the whole meadow system there fragments significantly. And again, here is Heather Meadows where we were working. This is Ptarmigan Ridge, Hannigan Pass, Twin Lakes, for those who know the area, and then several major breaks over here in Park Service land. So other climate change impacts of tree encroachment in subalpine meadows just basically mean that many of the meadows below 5,200 feet will be lost along with all the flowering plants. and we'll end up with forest, which has far fewer flowering plants for bumblebees. We'll have a decrease in the extent of elevation diversity, and I'll talk about that later. Basically, that means the elevation variability within a meadow. And I'll talk about why that's important as pollinators move from lower to higher during the season. And then with fewer subalpine meadow acres, fragmentation of meadows, decreased elevation, we may actually end up with reduced flowering plant species, available bumblebees, and that may reduce the bumblebee populations. So all of that's speculating what some of the impacts might be from climate change.
Quick question, Jim, that's relevant to your presentation right now. David
Sure.
Jennings asked if you, it sounded like you said you encountered Bombus, I think he meant sucklei, cuckoo bumblebee. Is that what you said?
Oh, let me look. We found Bombus fernald and Bombus sucklei, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Questions are welcome. So with that context, we sort of observed much of that just by wandering around up there before we put our study design structure in place. But we decided that we wanted to more formalize our study because we were finding such interesting things. And we wanted to establish a baseline inventory for flowering plants to see what happens over time as climate change has an impact on these mountains. We actually have aerial photographs of exactly where our transects are so that future investigators can replicate our work and see what they find in the exact same places. We wanted to identify the most important native flowering plants, better understanding the foraging behavior of North Cascades bumblebees, identify threats to long-term sustainability of the huckleberry meadows, and then finally help develop conservation recommendations for those meadows. Our study design, it was again a 5-year study design where we actually had structure and sampling protocols. We monitored meadows from very early snow melt, even when much of the meadow was not melted yet, to when it started snowing, usually in September. We had 7 transects in Heather Meadows, ranging in elevation from 4,200 feet to 5,200 feet. And each transect was about 600 feet long and 30 feet wide. And 2 of those transects were duplicates at one of the elevations. So we had 5 primary transects, we call them, at different elevations. And again, we had 15 volunteers. They monitored in teams of 2. On any given monitoring day, we usually had 2 teams going out. We monitor flowers every other week for 5 years. Remarkable volunteer effort, I must say. I'm very thankful for all the volunteers we had. And then I did special pollinator monitoring in 2019, again, every other week. And we only tallied pollinators that we actually saw on flowers. We obviously couldn't tell whether they were pollinating effectively, but if they were on the flower, we counted them. And then we also did a small catch and release study in 2020 that I'll say a little bit about, but it's not really a major focus of this talk. So we're looking at study results, flower abundance and phenology, pollinator abundance and phenology, pollinator preference, bumblebee nesting sites, and bumblebee foraging behavior. And this is probably the most important slide in my presentation. It's pretty complex, so I'll try to walk you all through it. You can see that we have our 5 primary transects: Picture Lake, Visitor Center, Austin Pass, Artist Point, and Pontoon Point. Obviously photos for those. Across the bottom, we have our sampling dates. We generally started May 1st, so 2 weeks out from May 1st, 4 weeks on to 20 weeks out from May 1st. We wanted to, when we first started, we wanted to count all the flowers, but it became very obvious very quickly that it's impossible to count all the flowers in Heather Meadows in the transects of the size we had. And so we ended up modifying and coming up with a system where we categorized flowers as none or no flowers present. That received a 0. 1 to 100 flowers, we called it rare. That received a 1. 101 to 1,000 flowers, we said was common. And then above 1,000 flowers, we said was abundant. And so you can see here how early in the season at Picture Lake, we had black huckleberry blooming shortly after Cascade blueberry came on. You can see those really peaked early in the season. And then pink mountain heather and white mountain heather came on, and Sitka mountain ash, then partridge foot, and finally fireweed. And as you move up from Picture Lake up all the way to Huntoon Point, you see how the season kind of shifted to the right. Blank areas was when there was snow cover and we couldn't even get in to monitor. It shifted to the right, and some of these transects had very abundant pollinators and others not so much. So it was very interesting to see the phenology of the plants as the season progressed. The next three slides I'm going to show you are from, this was 2019, are from 2015, 2017, and 2019. And 2015 was a very early snowmelt. It's probably the warmest summer on record for Heather Meadows. We actually had, we were seeing pollen flowers at Heather Meadows in early May, which is extremely unusual. And they were becoming quite a bit more abundant as the season moved along. And then very quickly it tapered off, and we saw far fewer, and looked like a very long season, but there weren't very many bumblebees or very many flowers later in the season. Real curious thing that we observed with pink mountain heather, there always seemed to be a pause where there would be a 2-week period where there was no pink mountain heather, and then it would start up again. That pretty much happened at every elevation. So it was, no other species did that. The one thing I added here, in addition to the numbers, you know, we have the 1s are rare, the 2s are common, and the 3s are abundant, is I tried to sum the number of transects that we visited on any given date within or the number of species within a transect on any given date that were at the common or abundant level, and that would be at the 2 or 3 level. And so the numbers highlighted in yellow are actually the number of species, flowering species at that transect that were at the common or abundant level. In other words, more than 100 or more than 1,000 flowers observed. And that was really interesting when I recognize that that's not a very good quantitative measure of flowering, but it did give us a good indication of what was going on in those meadows. And you notice at the very bottom, when you sum across all transects and all parts of the season, that over on the right, we had 50 monitoring events when we observed the flowers at the common or the abundant level. So this was 2015, sort of a climate change analog year. This is what we expect to happen with climate change over time. Then we moved to 2019, and this was actually what we ended up calling a typical year because it was very average compared to the other years that we monitored. And you can see everything is just the same in terms of the numbers and the accumulation and the yellow highlighted. Down at the bottom, though, over to the right, you can see that there were 67 monitoring events when we actually had common or abundant flowers present. So, which might be counter. You would think that a longer season that we had in 2015, you would have more monitoring events when you had common or abundant flowers. But we actually had more in 2019. And then if you move to 2017, this was actually the coldest and the latest snowmelt of all of the 5 years. And we had ultimately had even more periods, monitoring periods, when we had flowers at the common or abundant level. So a very counterintuitive move where the coldest season actually appears to have the most flowers, and the warmest season has the least flowers. Moving on to our bumblebee and other foragers, other pollinators. The plants along the bottom there are generally phenologically ordered. There's a few that, you know, kind of came all clustered all together, so it was arbitrary which one you put first from our data point of view. But generally, the early bloomers are on the left and the late bloomers are on the right. And we looked at spring bumblebee queens, other bumblebees, and that would include everything from fall queens to workers to males, just lump them all together, and other foragers. And what really jumps out, several things on this table, is that the Cascade blueberry and the pink mountain heather were by far the most attractive to pollinators. And even more striking was that if you look at Cascade blueberry and to some extent black huckleberry, they were almost exclusively dominated by bumblebees. They're the primary pollinators. And as you move over further into the season, you'll get Sitka mountain ash and partridge foot and pearly everlasting and subalpine spirea, which are being pollinated by other foragers. And that's everything from syrphids to solitary bees to vespids to beetles. We just lumped them all together for the purposes here. And if you, this is the data more finely grained presented, and it strikes you even more. Cascade blueberry in particular was especially dependent on bumblebees for pollination, with 19 spring bumblebee queens, 156 bumblebee workers, one unknown that we couldn't stage, and only 3 other insects observed during the entire season on Cascade blueberry. So it's really striking how dependent the huckleberries are on bumblebees in those meadows. Another interesting thing here is if you look at the honeybees and where they were most abundant, it was on partridge foot, Sitka mountain ash, and subalpine spirea. And so we thought that was interesting. It overlaps, but not a lot with bumblebee pollination. It particularly overlaps on Sitka mountain ash, but otherwise they seem to be somewhat segmenting the population of flowers for their foraging. And this table is even a little more complicated to explain. We basically looked at our 7 transects, all of them, and we looked at that's across the top, and on the left side, we looked at our monitoring dates in 2019. And the first number is the number of bumblebee queens, then bumblebee workers, and then honeybees for each one of those. And if you're looking in the upper left, you can see that we really have early season, lower elevation. We have our queens coming on. As you move down into later in the season, you'll get more queens. As you move to 624, we're starting then to get more workers than queens. It continues, and then about in July, we start seeing honeybees show up all of a sudden, and then that begins tapering off as the rest of the season until at the end, 8/18, we're seeing some of next year's queens emerging and getting ready to forage and overwinter. And then as you move to the right across there, you'll see in the upper right that many of those transects monitoring sites were actually snow covered, and so there was nothing there. If you look at Artist Point and you work your way down, you'll notice that there's 2 queens, 2 workers, 1 queen, 6 workers, and then in the fall it shifts, and we have 1 queen and 8 workers, 2 queens and 4 workers. But then look over at Huntoon Point, and there are no queens at all observed there, even though it was basically snow covered until late or mid-July, and then we found 6 workers up there, going up to 12 eventually. There were still never any queens, and so from that we concluded that the queens are primarily nesting in the lower elevations, and that it's the workers that are moving up slope and foraging for pollen and nectar later in the season, with probably no nest at the higher elevation. So one of our most interesting findings, I think. So just to summarize, I tried to pull out what I thought were the biggest points that we discovered. Tree islands, which I haven't talked a lot about, I will here in a second, but they're really important in the spring for early season establishment of bumblebee nest and queen foraging. The queen is out there foraging to produce that first group of workers. And when they can go into the tree islands, when all of the rest of the meadows are still very much snow covered, they get an early start on foraging for pollen and nectar. Bumblebees that nest in those tree islands at lower elevations are able to forage across the elevational gradient to take advantage of late season pollen and nectar resources. And that's what I was showing you in the last table. Late season high elevation foraging lengthens the overall foraging season because as things start drying up down below, the flowers are coming on higher up. And these flowers are particularly important late in the season for next season's queens as they're emerging. Three other sort of major findings. Bumblebees are responsible for nearly all huckleberry pollination in North Cascades meadows. This is really important for those who are interested in bear conservation, which I am. Huckleberries, the bears are really dependent on huckleberries for building up fat for overwintering. And so it's really critical that we not lose our huckleberries in those meadows. Again, Bombus melodipitchus, shown to be highly susceptible to heat stress, is the most important huckleberry pollinator in the North Cascades, with 76% of the bumblebees sampled. And then finally, foraging by introduced honeybees actually overlaps temporally and spatially with foraging by bumblebees, which provides a pathway, unfortunately, for viral disease transmission to wild bumblebees. So tree islands, let's say a little bit about them, since I think it's one of our most important findings. They're small clumps of trees up to 0.25 acres, and they're generally scattered throughout subalpine meadows. I'll have a photo of one for you here in a minute. Very early season huckleberries found only in tree islands where snow covers everything else. Bumblebees are highly dependent on these tree islands, with 97% of spring queens found on black huckleberries in tree islands. And our study also found transects with more extensive tree islands had higher numbers of bumblebees foraging. Nesting sites are also likely within tree islands. We only observed queens flying around when the rest of the meadow was still covered in snow. And then later in the season, we observed workers coming and going from what were probably nest sites in tree islands. So this is what we mean by a tree island. Trees with shrubs underneath. The limbs tend to shed the snow. The tree trunk tends to absorb heat and melt out faster. And so we'll be getting, there's probably already flowers blooming and bumblebees buzzing on this tree island, even though there's snow all around. Unfortunately, some of our tree islands in Heather Meadows look like this. Tree islands are the best shade available in Heather Meadows when you're out there in the summer. And so a lot of people tend to focus in the shade and unfortunately do significant damage to tree islands. Also, the importance of high elevation meadows. Queens and workers forage at lower elevations initially and then move up into the higher elevations later in the season. Bumblebee workers take advantage of later season blooming. They forage across these areas. And then they're also important sources of pollen and nectar for emerging queens. And here's what we generally mean by higher elevation meadows. This is our Artist Point transect. And you can see the pink heather and some of the lupin there. There's other flowers all scattered through there. This is where we're getting, some of the thousands of flowers in our transects that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, some of our higher elevation meadows are starting to look like this. And this is real close to the large parking lot up there in Heather Meadows. People have trampled everywhere. There doesn't seem to be any restrictions on where they go. And there are very few plants in this area that are actually attractive to pollinators. And then, of course, we have Twin Lakes, which looks like a bomb hit it. Heavy use for recreation and no plants at all, let alone plants that are attractive to pollinators. So hopefully we'll be able to have some impact to reduce pressures on these. And then I mentioned earlier, honeybees coming up into Heather Meadows in July. The honeybee keepers from lower elevations actually bring their hives up here in the summer when flowers decline at lower elevations. And they'll bring this many, I believe this is something like 96 hives. And this one was originally very close. This particular batch was close to Heather Meadows. Since that one, which was taken about 4 or 5 years ago, the Forest Service has told the beekeepers that they cannot bring their honeybees up near Heather Meadows anymore because they have records of Bombus occidentalis there. And they said, well, since we used to have a species that is now considered endangered, We can't allow honeybees up there, but they're everywhere else throughout that whole area of the North Cascades that I showed you. So we think it's real important to move from research to actually conservation. And so these are the things that we're recommending, primarily to the Forest Service, I suppose, but also to some extent to the Park Service. And we think that we've discovered enough threats to the pollinator flowering plant community that we really need to do some conservation planning around these issues in subalpine meadows. Bombus melanophygis is a critically important species up there. Needs to be recognized as a priority. Heather Meadows needs to be recognized as a priority conservation area. It provides great connectivity between Mount Baker and Mount Shuckson. Honeybee colonies really shouldn't be permitted within 5 miles of Mountain Meadows to prevent disease and parasite transmission. Bumblebee nest sites and tree islands should be protected, and new developments such as parking lots and trails hopefully will be discouraged if they are impacting flowers and pollinators. And as you probably know, those who are familiar with Heather Meadows, about every 10 years they expand the parking lots up there, and each one seems like a minor expansion, but cumulatively they're eating up a lot of habitat. Off-road vehicles and mountain bikes need to be restricted in North Cascades Meadows. Visitors in high elevation areas need to be restricted to hardened trails and overlooks, especially at Artist Point. Encroaching trees near fragmentation points could be eliminated, and then hopefully replaced with flowering plants. And we're trying to be so bold as to suggest that Bombus occidentalis could be reintroduced into that area. And finally, that to protect all of it, we actually create a pollinator refuge. And the Forest Service, unfortunately, is a multiple use agency. And they, at one point, were telling me that honeybees in subalpine meadows were like cows in subalpine meadows. It's a multiple use, and they had to allow it. And fortunately, they eventually found a way to keep them out of Heather Meadows for the most part, but other meadows throughout that area are still having being deluged with honeybees in the summer. So
before you move on, Jim, some relevant questions.
sure.
Elsie asks, what can we most effectively advocate for? How can we, excuse me, most effectively advocate for these excellent conservation recommendations? Is legislation needed? I'm assuming you've been feeding them to the Forest Service, but anyway, great question.
Yeah, for sure. We are actually, Shuckson Conservancy, we are actually organizing to do just that. And we are fortunate that we have pretty strong support from the tribes, the Nooksack tribe and the Upper Skagit tribe. Both of them have traditional territories in the vicinity of these meadows. And so we're organizing to encourage the Forest Service to make some of these policy changes. And we're also, at this point, early on, trying to put together some education programs for the general public, for school kids, and even for some of the Forest Service volunteers that are up there all summer. In my brief interactions with them over the last few years, they're very excited to learn about the pollinators in Heather Meadows and the flowering plants. I guess they've had no training in that, and so they're very grateful when we educate them on it. And so we're those are the things we have cooking right now, and hopefully we're going to move on. And who knows in the long run whether it's going to require actually policy changes. Creation of a pollinator refuge is more of a policy change, might even involve Congress. I don't know, maybe just the Forest Service. But for those who are interested, we really welcome your participation in Shuckson Conservancy. We are gearing up. We should have our website up and running within the next month. And we also have an Instagram account where we're going to try to keep people engaged in some of the issues. So hopefully that answers that question. The biggest thing is just contact me and I'll definitely rope you in. Was there another question too?
There was, that was on your last slide. What are fragmentation points? Cindy asks.
Okay, actually that's I'm going to get to that on my next slide after
Perfect.
this one. So I'll show what that is. So we're talking about a proposal for a North Cascades meadow pollinator refuge. There is no such thing currently in the United States. the closest thing would be a wildlife refuge, and many people consider insects as wildlife. So we're hoping that if we do move forward on that, it will fit in under that kind of category of refuge. And we think this refuge should include the core area of that starfish meadow that I was talking about earlier. I didn't really mention Ruth Mountain, but I'll show you where it is in a second on the map. Refuge should include passes below 5,200 feet, because we think that's where tree encroachment is going to occur, and it's where the fragmentation points are going to occur in that starfish meadow. And it's going to be both the Forest Service and the Park Service, which isn't always easy to work with both of them at the same time, but an effective pollinator refuge should probably include both. And then the pollinator refuge needs to come with some policies, kind of restricting new development, honeybee colonies, recreation activities, and to restore some of the native plants, potentially via controlled burns, maybe through mechanical means. So this is the map with the lines at 5,200 feet. And this again is Heather Meadows. This is what I consider a fragmentation point, because we go from the meadows that were contiguous all through here, almost all the way to Ross Lake, to meadows that are fragmented like this. Heather Meadows, Hannigan Pass, Twin Lakes, Welcome Pass, and then multiple places over on Park Service land where the fragmentation would occur. And these, I don't know if you can see the red dots there, but these are the exact fragmentation points that we're talking about. This is Welcome Pass, Twin Lakes, Hannigan Pass. This is Heather Meadows and Ptarmigan Ridge Trail, and a couple over in the Park Service land. What's interesting, if you actually look at those GIS maps, the topo maps, you can see that a place like Heather Meadows, if the tree line moves up to 5,200 feet, there's going to be a mile of intervening trees between Mount Baker and Mount Shuckson Meadows. So that's exactly what we mean by fragmentation. And the fragmentation points are these red dots that I have on here. We're recommending that any pollinator refuge actually include those fragmentation points so that they can be managed for native plant and pollinator populations, instead of cows and everything else, all the other multiple use issues that the Forest Service faces. So to sum up, I'd like to tell people that we're really looking at a comprehensive conservation program that's focused on bears, who are the recipients of huckleberries, who are the recipients of pollen and nectar from the bees. So it's a bears, berries, and bees conservation program. So thank you all for listening to all that.